Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for this segment, we have Shawn, Cruz, Head of Trading Strategist at TD Ameritrade, to discuss the April reading for the Investor Movement Index. IMX is TD Ameritrade's proprietary behavior-based index aggregating Main Street investor positions and activity to measure what investors actually were doing and how they were positioned in the markets. And Shawn, plenty of catalysts sparked elevated market volatility in April, but TD Ameritrade investors remain net buyers.
They were net buyers. And I think it's interesting when we say the IMX moved slightly lower, but we had some net buying activity. There's a little bit of a nuance to it. So although they were buying equities overall, what they were doing is the equities they were buying were just a little bit more lower volatility than some of the equities they were selling. So there's some interesting dynamics that went on underneath the hood of this past month. And it was certainly a volatile month. So it makes sense when it's already enough volatility going in the background and you layer on earnings season that we're going to see just a lot of interesting things out of client activity.
Yeah, Shawn, and what else is interesting is the traders need to think about alternating their mindset. It's no longer buy the dip, right? So what were your investors buying at this point?
So we're seeing is when they are going in and they're seeing it's not just if any day it's down a little bit, they wait until there's some pretty significant pullbacks in some of these names before they'll go in and start taking little bites. So they're not going in just buying the dip with both hands, but as some of the names they have had their eyes on and have been popular over the past couple of years continue to pull back, they're just gradually taking small bites on the way down, which I think is the smart way to play a market like this. And the one thing I think that's worth noting is also how they're going about getting those funds is they're actually taking profits in some of those sectors and some of those names that have been holding up well. So that's the little nuance that I think has been going on right now. And when we look at what some of these companies have done coming out of their earnings reports, especially on the tech side, they've had some pretty decent pullbacks. And I think it makes sense. You see investors using those earnings induced pullbacks as an opportunity to buy. To me, it just shows that they're ready to ride out some short-term volatility and keeping their eye a little bit more on sort of the long-run prospects for some of these companies.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I saw the Millennial Buyers at TD Ameritrade. One of their top buys was Microsoft. I've been looking at the stock now; it's down nearly 21% on the year. Company like that, I mean, the valuations that they're at now. Micron's another great example. It makes sense to pick at some of these names here.
It does. And I think if you look at a company like Microsoft, I don't think anyone is concerned that there's going to be some other company that comes in and completely replaces Windows. And if you look at where they're making strides in some of the other more visible places in the cloud computing space is one thing they're getting a lot of coverage on some of the gains they're able to make there, but also going into other areas that I think millennials are much more familiar with. And that is looking at shoring up some of their gaming segment. They have Xbox. Now they're looking at acquiring Activision Blizzard. So they're starting to really get a nice diverse revenue stream, but it's diverse, but it's still focused sort of in that consumer, serving that consumer segment and using some pretty high advanced technology to do that. So I think if you're looking at what millennials are focused on and what we heard from Microsoft, they had a pretty good report. I think the market, it was well received. So now it makes sense, even amongst the volatility we're seeing right now, you're going to probably see investors come in and use it to focus on some of these more, high value. They're already profitable. The outlook remains strong. They're going to use this short-term volatility that is just driving the market overall as opportunity to come in and acquire some of these names.
Yeah, and Shawn, I would agree with you 100%. I mean, there were names where valuations had to be reset. Companies that weren't making money, weren't profitable. We saw a number of them come public last year. But to wrap up here, as we talk about volatility, as of now, Shawn, spot VIX is at 34.5. Right? Last year when we had the 2020, when we had the volatility around the COVID pandemic, it was trading, north of 80. It seems to me that at 34.5, you'd expect the VIX to be trading higher. I mean, we're seeing steep losses, certainly for the past 3 days.
I think so, but I think it's a great point to set that next to is what we saw during the early stage of the pandemic, when there was just so much uncertainty and so much just panic around what was going to happen with global markets, what was going to happen with some of these global economies. When you're looking at full-on lockdowns, now that we're seeing some of this uncertainty come in to creep into the markets here, we're not seeing the VIX rip higher up towards those 80s, 50, 60 levels. I think what we're seeing is it shoots up towards this 34, 35 level. We've been here a couple times before this year. That just shows that there is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of concern. But usually that is where you start to see a lot of traders come in and use some of these buying opportunities, and long-term investors. And that typically is where you see a pretty swift pullback in the VIX. Once it gets up these 35 levels, we typically don't hang up here for long. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out this week. We've got a lot of important data coming out, but I'm also interested to see how investors treat some of these pullbacks now that we're breaking through some pretty significant levels. I think next month when we come out and take a look at the IMX, it's going to be really interesting to keep an eye on.
Yeah, looking forward to that, Shawn. Appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.